Each of us are formed by stories that exist in our families. Sometimes they're very sad stories of suffering, of untimely death, of survival. Sometimes they're very happy stories of romance, fortune, people coming together. And sometimes they're a mix of both. And out of these stories come values and understandings that impact upon the direction of our lives. So, for example, one of the stories that shapes me is that of a grandmother. Didn't have much financially, tended her husband who for 50 years had poor health, lost both her legs to diabetes, yet was unfailingly happy, positive, and hospitable to whoever came to her door. And not surprisingly, a lot of people came to her door. She was a legend and she left a legacy. I learned that happiness is not dependent on circumstance, but on attitude. Communities, too, have stories, as do nations, as do churches. These stories shape our kaupapa, our values, and are a big part of the formation of those who belong and those who join. And as people formed by the stories, we live out that kaupapa and create new stories. St. Luke's here has many stories. In the 1960s, St. Luke's acquired a property which we would call te whetū. It was local. It was originally for the purpose of providing a hostel for young Māori women attending Auckland Girls' Grammar. A deaconess in the parish was the matron. Over the next 2 decades, the ministry of te whetū evolved, catered for both high school and beyond high school learning. It included Pākehā young women, and for a time too, young Māori men. It later became a home for those living with mental ill health, and then for refugees. Note the themes here. Providing for those with a need rather than trying to increase church membership. Commitments to education and good health. Commitments not limited by age or culture. This is the kaupapa of manaakitanga, hospitality. Later in 1980, the house was sold and the capital used in the development of the now community centre, through which this kaupapa of manaakitanga continued. The counselling arm of Presbyterian Support, later HD&T, was to be resident here. Education would feature strongly in the centre's programs and activities, as would the desire to be outward-facing, responsive to the surrounding community. This kaupapa of manaakitanga, meeting need, has and will continue to require us to question what we're doing, who we are serving and who we aren't, and how can we prepare for the needs ahead. Another big St. Luke's story is what happened in the aftermath of appointing my predecessor, David Clark, an openly gay minister, here in 1988. For the next 24 years, particularly as the governance of the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, became increasingly conservative, David would be subjected to significant criticism and vitriol from Presbyterians and others outside our parish. And St. Luke's would increasingly become more protective of David and more aligned openly with thinking and theologies that promoted the acceptance and celebration of people, regardless of their sexual orientation. This is the kōpapa of awhitanga, inclusivity. An inclusive congregation is not one that simply puts a sign out the front that says, all are welcome. Rather, an inclusive congregation thinks deeply, takes sides, and acts in the large and far-reaching debates around sexuality, around race, gender, poverty. Awhitanga, embrace of all, will require us to keep on changing and keep on taking sides. In the large anthology of Jewish and Christian stories, which we call Scripture and Tradition, there are not dissimilar stories about manaakitanga and awhitanga. And I've chosen two as the readings in church today. The first is the parable of the lighthouse. Now, this old story comes from the end of the theological continuum that operates with a paradigm of saved and unsaved people, the former being part of the church and the latter not. But the parable transcends this paradigm in its critique of churches as clubs. For regardless of one's theology, if your purpose is to help those in need, then any and every church can fall into the fallacy of defining needs solely in reference to their existing membership. In the parable, meeting need was rescuing people at sea. The original people, the original group, had that kōpapa of meeting need as their primary and sole focus. But as more people joined, that kōpapa shifted to the meeting needs of members rather than the needs of those at risk of drowning. Now, the needs of members are important to any church or organization. Building relationships, caring for one another, the kōpapa of whānau-matanga, and having facilities that facilitate that. These things are not unimportant. The problem is that those needs can easily take precedence over the needs of those outside the membership, those drowning in the sea in the parable. And so in the parable, conflict arose in the club and a split occurred over priorities. Then history repeated, and another split, and in time it repeated, and another split. And the challenge for us is how to, while valuing relationship building and care among our whānau here, the church, continue to prioritize the needs of those beyond our doorstep and adapt our clubhouse, our buildings, with that priority in mind. The second reading for the day is the biblical story of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, the rich man in this parable is not an overt evildoer. He's part of the urban elite. His wrongdoing is his preoccupation with his own needs and the needs of his whānau, and his indifference to those outside his societal circumference. The Bible as a whole is clear. Everything belongs to God. We own nothing. We are kaitiaki, stewards. Wealth is not condemned in Scripture, nor is enterprise. But the pull of wealth to draw us away from God's priorities is. Wealth has a way of saying, you deserve me, and I deserve you. It's very seductive. And in its seduction, it asks us to forget that we are all one human family. By contrast with the rich man, Lazarus is a destitute beggar, knowing abject poverty and the psychological poverty of estrangement from his own family. He is likely one from a rural community driven by the need to seek work in the towns, but due perhaps to the oversupply of labor, perhaps to misfortune or malnourishment or illness, he's been unsuccessful and ended up on the streets. The storyteller wants to bring Lazarus and the rich man into close proximity. But the reality was then, as it is now, society tries to keep poverty out of sight and out of mind. Lazarus is also portrayed as ritually unclean, a sinner. Religion often concludes with the notion that poverty is the fault and the result of the one who is poor. They've done something wrong, something that has offended God, the fates, and this is the consequence. As for the dogs licking his wounds, they're trying to show affection, trying to heal his wounds. The dogs, interestingly, are the compassionate ones in this parable. Sometimes grace appears in unlikely guises. In the world of the story, the rich man and Lazarus end up in the afterlife before Father Abraham. Abraham, indeed, in scripture, tradition, and culture, is the father of both. So the inconvenient and unwanted truth is that they are kin. The rich man cannot see the simple truth that Lazarus is his brother and his brother is suffering. And so the rich man does nothing. Stories are central to the religious identity of any people. The psychologist Jerome Bruner has written that stories become recipes for structuring experience itself. And Nancy Amarin likewise notes, religious narratives are the building blocks of individual and collective religious identities. Stories shape us. We carry with us a collection of religious narratives that shape our consciousness here at St. Luke's. And the parable of the rich man and Lazarus is one of them. Think of the messages in the story. Wealth is to be shared with those in need. That's the wealth of our time and our buildings, as well as bank accounts. We're all kin across social, economic, and cultural divides. So their need is our need, and we need to collaborate in order to build a wider community of well-being. Compassion, awhitanga, empathy, generosity, empowerment. These things shape our beliefs and actions. And actions, even little ones. Think of the dogs licking, are commended. Recently, I invited our parish council to dream of how we might extend hospitality, the kaupapa of manaakitanga, here at St. Luke's. Over the last decade or so, we've built strong relationships with groups beyond our doorstep, like East Tamaki School, Aotearoa Development Cooperative, Pillars, Restorative Justice, and some cross our doorstep to meet here. What we haven't done is think about building a new or redesigning our space to be a welcoming place where people living round about, an increasing number of people, can feel at ease dropping in to sit, relax, meet friends, have a cuppa. We need to think about who we might want to extend hospitality to and how. What and whose needs are we trying to address? We need to think about the shortcomings of our existing kitchen and common room and what might suit both our needs and the needs of those outside our membership. Some things we could do immediately, like signage and flyers. Other things will need discussion, planning, and fundraising. In such a process, our stories and the kaupapa that arises from our stories offer guidance, but they won't tell us what to do. Blessings.